Hello everyone, my name is Louise Sieg, and today I'll be presenting paper 69, Spatially Aggregating Mobility Data, Implications and Challenges, which was co-written with my PhD supervisor, James Cheshire. So in this 20-minute presentation, I'll introduce very briefly my wider PhD project because this abstract sits nicely within it. I'll tell you about the data that we're using for this analysis, give you a brief context of the paper, its aim, the methodology behind it, show you some of our results and discuss those results. So just a tiny bit about me. I'm a first-year PhD student at UCL in UCL Geography as part of the Consumer Data Research Center, the CDRC, which you probably have heard of if you've been to a few of our talks this week. And I'm an early career researcher, obviously, as a first-year PhD student. My working title for my project so far is Urban Vitality, the Value and Provenance of New Forms of Data. And my project is going to be focusing more or less on evaluating a massive big data geolocalized data set that was provided to us by the company HUK in red under here. And seeing how the data can be used, how it can be aggregated, but also evaluating questions regarding ethics and privacy with these types of data sets, and the wider use of these types of consumer data types in research. So because this data is so central to my project and to the abstract I'm presenting, I'm just giving you a little rundown of it. So it's basically composed of mobile phone GPS locations collected by in-app activities across the UK and stored by the company HUK. So applications obviously request consent from the users to store the location, which is the notification that you may have seen while using Citymapper or any sort of location tracking application. It's considered a consumer data set, and by that, I mean data that is often passively collected in the form of transactions or cookies or analytics. And consumer data is data that's collected by companies often to conduct market analysis or gain information on their consumer base. So in that sense, consumer data is not collected purposefully for research, which is important when we're trying to make it into a product that is usable for research, because it becomes problematic later on. So the specific HUK dataset is around 1 terabyte of individual data points. I can only access it through secured facilities that have been mentioned, I think, by Tongxin right before. For example, the DSH or the Secure Lab from UCL. So just a little bit of context. The wider context of this paper sits in the middle of a shift in the way research is conducted in geography, which we're all rarely aware of because we're, as practitioners in GIS, we've been working from scarce data or data that was often hard to collect to now very noisy, complex, and massive data sets. And consumer data sets that I've mentioned earlier are becoming increasingly attractive for research due to their size and the potential that they have, especially for mobility research. And more specifically, mobile phone locations data has been at the forefront of the COVID-19 spread analysis, or even in analyzing the impact of lockdown on activity levels in urban spaces. So you would have seen a lot of speakers talk this week or will present later on papers related to the pandemic, including the two papers before me, using these types of big mobile phone data sets on the COVID-19 pandemic mobility analysis. So I've just put on the slides there SafeGraph, which have made a big dashboard for COVID using similar types of data in the US. And on the right is a map from the CDRC in Liverpool, tracking COVID mobility, tracking human mobility over Christmas in the UK and how that may have impacted spread of COVID-19. So, like I said, a lot of people have demonstrated this week as well, these types of data sets are very attractive and have a lot of potential for these types of analysis. However, they come with their drawbacks, specifically ethical concerns around privacy, confidentiality, consent. A key paper by Montoya and al. Demonstrates how individuals can be pretty much retraced from point data sets, especially at a granular level, such as the HUK dataset that I'm using. So any data point below a count of 3, as we know as statistical researchers, any data point below a count of 3 is a breach of confidentiality, and any data point below a count of 10 is not ideal. So in this paper and many other of the type, they answer the question, is de-identification sufficient? And the answer is no. Aggregating the data set is very important and central to prevent data misuse and confidentiality breaches in those types of data when we use these types of data sets. So I flagged up the locus charter if you wanted to read more about like good practices in using these types of location data sets, because they try and protect individual and the public interest by improving the standards of practice. So if you want to read more, you can go, because I'm not going to delve too deeply into data ethics specifically today. So aggregating then is super important to make the data set more tractable, to make it confidential, to de-identify individual points. And our original data, our original HUG data, was also technically challenging and computationally intensive on top of being a breach of confidentiality, because it's almost a terabyte. It requires a lot of data cleaning and a lot of knowledge of data science, which as social scientists or geographers, we don't necessarily have. So the point is creating aggregates that people can then use despite not having that technical knowledge. However, the problem with third-party aggregated data sets is that sometimes all of the aggregation process, the original data, is in the black box. And we're left with an aggregate that is surely, of course, still not safer, tractable, and cleaner, but also has a lot of other problems with it. It's not always transparent. There are unknown biases in the data that if we can't see the original data, we're not aware of. We don't know how the data was changed in the process of aggregation. We don't know how the original data was collected or what these squares would mean. So is the data actually representative of what we're trying to analyze? And how do we ensure it is if we don't know how the aggregates were made or what the original data looks like? So if everything happens in a black box, how are we sure analysis is relevant, basically? So with that in mind, the aim of our abstract was to explore the impact of different levels of aggregation on the linkage of mobile phone activity data to standard statistical geographies and products. And two sub-goals of this for my wider project were to first create aggregates of the HUG data at different scales, because I'll have to use this data and I'll have to make analyses with it, so having aggregates will be useful, but also to highlight what to consider when we're creating aggregated data sets to inform future use and decision. So basically conduct an initial analysis of what should we look out for when we create aggregates. So for the methodology, this is, sorry for the small print, it's a bit overwhelming, but this is more to give an idea of how involved the initial cleaning process was. So this is pretty much my diagram for my cleaning process. And in orange is just the geodemographic classification linkage. So it's only 2, 3, 4, 5 steps maybe. Whereas everything in green was cleaning, reformatting the data, and making it into activity counts that are aggregated. So just so you have an idea of that process. So for this paper, we worked with a subset of our data set to make it more manageable. And we picked the borough of Westminster in London over rush hours, Monday to Friday of 1 week. Rush hours are typically 7:45 to 9:45, but because we aggregated our activity counts per hour, we thought we'd keep 7 to 10 to have the entire time period present. Then we spatially joined our initial granular data set, a data point data set, to varied scales and varied shape files. We used 2 different ones to compare them to each other. The Ordnance Survey grids, OSGB grids at 3 different scales, 250 meters by 250 meters, 500 by 500, and 1 kilometer square. And then we did the census geography output areas, which probably a lot of you are familiar with. They came up in a lot of talks. I think Tongxing used the MSOAs. And again, 3 different scales, output areas being the very lowest, and MSOA being the highest of the 3 that we have chosen. And we derived activity counts from having joined our data points to those grades. So what we mean by an activity count is a number of unique mobile device per grid cell or output area per hour, and that's 1 activity. So to have an idea, this is what an activity count map would look like. Everything in gray is either missing or the counts were too low to be disclosed and displayed for ethical reasons, for confidentiality breaches reasons. So that's the 250 by 250 grid. Westminster over a validation period, and the cumulated activity counts over the whole validation period. And if we overlay Westminster, just so you have an idea, for people who don't know London really well, there are a lot of parks. This is Hyde Park in the middle and Regents, which will be relevant for in a bit. And you can see that a lot of the highest activities, the deeper reds, overlap with tube stations, which is quite encouraging, meaning that the data seem to be, at first glance, representative. So still part of the methodology, we then, after we created all of those counts at all the different grids, at all the different scales that I've mentioned, we then link them to geodemographic classification to evaluate how the analysis of that geodemographic classification may vary depending on what grid we've used. So for that, we've used the London workplace zone classification, which is a statistics on workers' numbers and characteristics based on where they work in London. So if you want to know more about the London workplace zone classification, you can go on the London Data Store website, or the CDRC has a very nice interactive map that you can play around with and see how your borough, what the subgroups are represented. So I'd suggest you go there to hear more about the WPZs. And we basically assigned a workplace zone subgroup to each of our or up areas using population-weighted centroids. So we use population-weighted centroids to assign the subgroup with the highest population, where multiple groups overlapped one cell. So our linkage would be representative of worker population instead of spatial area. So we also created a control, which is a direct join with the workplace zone geographies, geographies, yeah, in order to evaluate our aggregates. So for example, if you were giving the initial granular data set with all the data points in the secure lab to create an analysis on workplace zone geographies, you would probably do that. You would do a spatial join directly to the workplace zone geographies, and it would be more relevant. However, if you're given an aggregated data set, you can't do that. You need to then assign a subgroup to your aggregated scale and conduct your analysis like that. So this is just our control. And these are our different scales with their subgroups assigned. So these are not the activity levels, these are the subgroups to the scales. And you can see, for example, in the 250 by 250 meter grid, because we assigned it using population weighted centroids. Where's the laser pointer? I'm going to use that. Yeah, because we use population weighted centroids, you can see that parks like Hyde Park and Regent's Park don't have that much a subgroup assigned because there was no population to assign it to. In terms of the results, this is a comparison of the activity means per subgroup per different grid type there, and then the proportion of the activity means the activity subgroup, sorry, per activity type again. But just to illustrate what happens here, if you had been given the 1 kilometer grid for your analysis on the workplace zones, this is the result that you would have, the population impression of Westminster at rush hour that you would get, where professional, retail, and leisure in dynamic central locations constitutes almost 3/4 of the registered activity at that time, and only 4 other subgroups appear. But if you were given the 250 meter grid, for example, it's only 50% that is professional, retail, and leisure, and 6 other subgroups appear against the 1 kilometer 4. So this is very different population profiles that you get at Westminster for rush hour, and the only thing that changed between those two results is the aggregated scale. So because our data set does not encompass the entire population, it's normal to see lower activity counts overall in the means results on the left. But what is most important is not the total activity counts, but rather how the impression of the area, changes, or the question of are certain demography, over or underestimated compared to the control, compared to a direct join to that geography. And yes, obviously, we can see that they're quite inconsistent across the different scales. So we run correlation tests with between all of our scales and our control, and they all return significant values. The strongest relationship was between the 250 by 250 grid, closely followed by the output areas. So we, as predicted, the lower scale preserved the granularity of the data and thus were a bit more accurate than the higher scales But we'll touch on that a little bit more in a bit. Grids tended to perform better overall than output area geographies, which was quite interesting. And that could be because output areas are census boundaries and typically represent a residential or a nighttime statistic, whereas the grids tended to be more neutral and give more flexibility for daytime analyses like workplace zones to shine through. This last graph that I have up here basically compares the proportion, per subgroup between the control and the 250 by 250 grid. The outline represents the control and the yellow fill is the grid. And you can see that though the grid had a very high correlation with the control, you can still see that the professional retail leisure is overestimated by almost 10%. And high street destinations and accessible retail are underestimated. We need to delve into further research to understand why these populations and other populations are over and underestimated, and whether that's a factor of dynamism or a question of density or a question of how the linkage were done with and spatially joined. But we need to understand that in order to scale up our aggregates. So to discuss this, we can safely say that aggregation scales influence the final analysis very clearly. Final aggregated products must take these impacts into consideration in the decision making. And smaller scales seem to be the most accurate, obviously. However, because of ethical purposes and confidentiality breaches, any count under 10 must be hidden, resulting in significant data losses if you go too small a scale, which we really brushed with the 250 by 250 grid. Any smaller and we'd have to omit a lot of our data set, especially, and that is at a very busy time at a very busy part of London. So on our wider UK data set, we very often be below that 10 activity count number and we'd have to emit data. So that's something that needs to be considered. What scale would be the healthy middle for this? And this exploratory analysis highlights the importance of transparent methodologies when making aggregates. So if there are issues with sample bias, if there are issues with aggregates changing the data even ever so slightly, this needs to be flagged up so the analysis can stay relevant. So obviously concerns were raised about data bias when converting large consumer data sets into exploitable research data with this analysis. And discrepancies cannot be neglected, especially because they may worsen when the analysis is scaled up. And we all have to deal with the modifiable aerial problem, unit problem as geographers, the MOP. And obviously, this is only going to be exacerbated. These issues, with aggregates can only be exacerbated when we change either temporarily or spatially our scale. There could also be sampling biases in original data sets, and these need to be accounted for, or like I said, at least flagged up for when we're creating data sets for wider use in research, because research may impact planning, may impact things in the future from which these sampling biases, could be actually dangerous. So Sarah Williams outlines this very well in her book, Data Action, and outlines the principles of positive impacts of data and the dangerous impact of sampling bias in algorithm research, planning, etc. So I'd suggest you read her book if you want to know more about how harmful sampling bias can be when not accounted for. And the last point with this research was that the grid cells seem to be especially pertinent if the data product is to be used across analysis ranging from census to more daytime statistics. So if you were doing your census-specific analysis, obviously you would want to use the output area. But if we're creating a blanket aggregate to use in a general sense, we might want to be working with something that is a bit more neutral in case we're analyzing a daytime geodemography or something similar. That's something we're going to have to analyze more. And finally, now what are we working on? So basically exploring other scales and grid types like the Uber H3 hexagonal grid system that's on the left, those globes on the left, conduct a sensitivity analysis for a more accurate decision-making process when we settle on an aggregated format to scale up to our whole HUC dataset on the UK scale, and further analysis to understand the impact of dynamism and density on the discrepancies, like why it was underestimated in the 250 grid. And if you wanted to talk to me more about this or have any questions or have cool data to share, this is my email. Thank you very much.
First question is, have you planned to expand this analysis to non-urban areas? And how would the counts, the limits of disclosure of under 10, change what grids you could use in rural areas where obviously I guess the activity will be a lot less.
Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a big problem, obviously, and that's something that is problematic with the HUG dataset because it's there's lots of activity counts in urban spaces but not in rural areas. Something that we were thinking about was possibly using nested grids, so grids that would group up in a bigger grid, counts above 10. So instead of having static grids, we'd have grids of a certain numbers, which means that grids would get bigger in rural areas and hopefully smaller in urban areas where the counts are bigger. But obviously that's something I'm going to have to, there's going to be a lot of heuristics to be done in order to work with that.
Brilliant, thanks Louise. I've just figured out how to see people's names in this, so sorry about that, Nick, I missed you before. So next question is from Patrick. Great talk, Louise. Really interesting discussion on the black box of aggregated mobility data. Could you please give us a feel for how the findings of this study might be used? E.g., do you think HUC or CDRC would be likely to release the data products that reflect issues with spatial scales highlighted by your work?
So we're working right now on creating this aggregate for the HUG data with the documentation along with it, to have those transparent aggregates for hopefully wider use in research. So I'm not sure how the release would happen or to who would be releasing to, but that's a name that we're working on. And sorry, what was the other part of this question?
So it was how, could you give us a feel of how the findings of this study might be used? So for instance,
yes. So there'll be, hopefully, we're just trying to flag up issues with, you may have used those third-party aggregated data, and maybe this can help you identify things that are not okay with those data sets and things to request from the provider of the data. And hopefully we're trying to get to a point where of a new type of, what's the word, standard for those data sets, where if we're creating third-party data, if we're involved in the creation of them, or if we're using them to do better or ask for more transparency with these data types. So that's an impact that we're hoping to have.
Thank you. So Tonzin asks, is your HUC data set covering the whole of the UK area?
So it's in-app mobile phone data, so obviously there's issues of coverage. I'm going to have to look into, I'm actually working right now to figure out exactly where the coverage goes and where we have issues with it. It is a UK-wide data set, but obviously there'll be blank areas that we're going to have to account for.